In the winter of 1941, Adolf Hitler made a choice that would fundamentally transform the nature of industrial murder. A decision made not in the heat of passion or the fog of war, but in the calculated quiet of his private quarters. A choice that would ultimately seal the fate of 6 million human beings and reshape the very definition of evil itself. And this is where our story begins. Not with the roaring crowds or the torchlit rallies, but in the shadows of a man's conscience, as it shattered into fragments, piece by piece, decision by decision, choice by choice, until nothing remained but a void where humanity had once existed. And we begin here, because understanding how a failed Austrian painter, with a threadbare mustache and a voice that scraped like gravel, became the architect of the worst catastrophe in human history, requires that we trace the incremental descent into barbarism, the slow crossing of thresholds that made each subsequent darkness seem only slightly more unthinkable than the last. A process of moral erosion that unfolded not as a sudden descent into chaos, but as a series of rational, deliberate steps that logic can follow and comprehend. To understand the trajectory of Hitler's darkest decisions, we must travel back to the moment when the transformation from political opportunist to genocidal dictator first began, back to the beer halls and the poverty of post-World War I Munich, where a traumatized veteran emerged from the trenches convinced that Germany had been betrayed not by military defeat, but by internal enemies, by Jews, by communists, by anyone who did not fit his rigid vision of racial purity and national revival, a conviction born partly from genuine economic hardship and partly from his own psychological need to find scapegoats for his personal failures and his nation's humiliation. And this psychological pattern, the creation of enemies to blame for one's own misfortunes, would become the animating force behind his entire political project. Hitler's darkest decisions did not spring forth fully formed from a demonic imagination. Rather, they emerged from a toxic combination of Victorian-era racial pseudoscience, economic desperation, political opportunism, and a profound psychological malformation that allowed him to view human beings not as individuals worthy of dignity, but as biological material to be sorted, classified, and disposed of like garbage. A framework of thought that would provide the conceptual justification for decisions that would ultimately dwarf all previous atrocities in human history, in their scale and their systematic nature. And it is important to understand that this framework was not unique to Hitler. It drew upon currents of racial thinking that were widespread in early 20th century Europe and America. But Hitler's distinction lay in his willingness to pursue these ideas to their logical and horrifying conclusion. The first of his darkest decisions came in 1933, when, having seized power through a combination of backroom dealing with conservative politicians who believed they could control him, and electoral success among a desperate population seeking strong leadership during economic crisis, Hitler made the conscious choice to begin the systematic legal persecution of Jews. A decision that started with boycotts of Jewish businesses organized by the Nazi SAA and escalated through the Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of citizenship and forbade intermarriage with Aryans, creating a comprehensive legal framework that transformed prejudice into governmental policy and marked the beginning of a descent into barbarism that would accelerate with each passing year and with each new threshold crossed. And each of these steps seemed small at the time. Each seemed like a reasonable extension of the previous policy, and each made the next step seem only slightly more radical than what had come before. These weren't spontaneous acts of mob violence or the uncontrolled outbursts of a dictator surrounded by yes-men. They were deliberate, calculated policies enacted by a government that had secured the cooperation of lawyers, judges, bureaucrats, and businessmen who either embraced or tolerated the systematic dehumanization of millions of their fellow citizens, and in many cases, these ordinary Germans derived economic benefit from the persecution, as Jewish property was confiscated and redistributed among the Nazi faithful, creating a constituency with a vested interest in the continuation and escalation of persecution, a dynamic in which genocide became intertwined with economic self-interest and personal profit. But persecution, no matter how thorough or how cruel, was merely the prelude to something far more sinister. And in 1938, Hitler made another crucial decision that would set the stage for catastrophe: the annexation of Austria, an act of aggression that violated international law and the Treaty of Versailles, and demonstrated to the world that the Western democracies lacked either the will or the courage to stand against him, a realization that emboldened him to make bolder moves still. Knowing that appeasement would be met with further appeasement, that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness, and that the global order, fractured and exhausted from the First World War, lacked the unified response necessary to stop him before his ambitions grew even larger, and Hitler had learned that he could take what he wanted, as long as he did so incrementally, and as long as no single power was prepared to risk war to stop him. The Sudetenland followed in 1938, a region of Czechoslovakia populated by ethnic Germans, followed by the complete occupation of Czechoslovakia in 1939. And with each conquest, Hitler's confidence grew exponentially. His ambitions swelled beyond even his previous calculations, and the machinery of the German state, now fully mobilized for conquest through massive rearmament and the conscription of millions, continued its relentless expansion of military production and territorial ambition, generating the economic momentum that would drive Hitler toward ever greater gambles and ever darker decisions. And the Nazi economy itself became dependent upon conquest, upon the seizure of foreign resources and foreign labor, creating a dynamic in which peace meant economic collapse and only endless expansion could sustain the regime. Then came September 1st, 1939, the day Hitler made perhaps his most fateful decision: the invasion of Poland, which finally forced Britain and France to abandon their policy of appeasement and declare war, plunging the world into a conflict that would consume 50 million lives and reshape the map of human civilization itself. A decision that Hitler had consciously calculated but believed that Britain and France would ultimately back down from, that the Western democracies lacked the nerve to fight. A miscalculation rooted in his ideological conviction that decadent liberal societies could not stand against the iron will of the Nazi state, and that class conflicts would tear the Western democracies apart before they could mount an effective response. Yet even as Germany's armies swept across Europe with stunning speed and efficiency, crushing the French in a military victory of such rapidity that it seemed to validate Hitler's belief in German racial superiority and his own strategic genius, and even as the swastika flew over Paris and the German military appeared invincible, there existed within the Nazi leadership a parallel ambition that grew darker and more urgent with each passing month. A darker dream that extended far beyond territorial conquest and military victory. A vision articulated in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, written years earlier but now approaching its horrifying realization: the creation of a racially pure Germanic empire. A Lebensraum, or living space, that would be populated exclusively by Aryans, which would require the removal, by whatever means necessary, of all those deemed racially inferior or ideologically dangerous. A vision so vast in scope that it contemplated the restructuring of an entire continent according to Nazi racial ideology and the displacement or murder of millions of people who did not fit this vision. The decision to implement the Holocaust did not come as a sudden thunderbolt from Hitler's mind on a particular date. Rather, it evolved through a series of escalating decisions and compromises, each one crossing a threshold of moral depravity that made the next step seem incrementally less unthinkable. A psychological process that historians refer to as the cumulative radicalization of the Nazi regime. where moderate evil begat more extreme evil, where persecution begat enslavement, where enslavement begat systematic starvation and forced labor, where starvation and slave labor begat mass shooting operations, and where mass shooting operations begat the decision to industrialize murder itself through the creation of extermination camps. And each transition seemed logical given the previous decision. Each seemed like a natural extension of what had come before, and each made those responsible less willing to reverse course. In the Eastern Territories conquered by Germany in the invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, mobile killing squads known as Einsatzgruppen, tasked with eliminating what the Nazis termed undesirables, began shooting millions of Jews, Roma, and Soviet prisoners of war in mass graves and ravines and ditches, creating a system of slaughter so efficient and so vast that it claimed over 1 million victims in the span of just 2 years. And yet this method of killing, for all its horror and all its scale, was deemed insufficient by the Nazi leadership, who believed that this piecemeal approach lacked the speed, the scale, the economy of effort, and the efficiency necessary to accomplish their ultimate goal of completely eradicating European Jewry across the continent. And the perpetrators of these mass shootings reported psychological strain from the work, suggesting that even the killers found constant direct participation in mass murder to be psychologically difficult, leading the Nazi leadership to believe that a system that could murder at industrial scale while removing the perpetrators from direct contact with victims would prove more efficient and psychologically tolerable for those doing the killing. This realization led to what historians call the final solution, a decision made at some point between late 1940 and mid-1941. The exact timing remains a matter of scholarly debate. To construct specialized extermination camps equipped with gas chambers, crematoria, and an elaborate administrative apparatus, industrial facilities designed with one purpose alone: the efficient and systematic murder of human beings on an unprecedented scale. And the Nazi architects of this decision drew inspiration from industrial processes and rationalized murder as a technical problem to be solved through engineering and administration, treating the industrialization of genocide as though it were no different than the construction of factories or the organization of rail transport, a decision that reflects the modernist mindset of the Nazi leadership, their belief that all problems could be solved through proper planning and application of technical expertise. The Wannsee Conference of January 20, 1942, served as the bureaucratic endpoint of this decision, a meeting held in a villa in the Wannsee district of Berlin where Nazi officials gathered to coordinate and systematize the murder of 11 million Jews across the entire European continent, though by this point the machinery of death was already in motion, already claiming thousands of lives each week in camps and through mass shootings, and the gathered bureaucrats, including the infamous Adolf Eichmann, who would coordinate the transportation of millions to their deaths, were essentially formalizing and refining a process already underway, converting a series of ad hoc decisions and evolving practices into a comprehensive, continent-wide system of industrialized murder. And the fact that this meeting even took place, that Nazi officials felt the need to formalize and coordinate genocide, reveals the modernity of the Holocaust and its origins in bureaucratic rationality. Auschwitz-Birkenau, which would become the greatest charnel house in human history, a place that would witness the systematic murder of approximately 1.1 million people, was expanded dramatically following Hitler's decision to pursue extermination rather than mere persecution or forced emigration. And by 1943 and 1944, the camp was murdering thousands of people each day, processing them through an assembly line of death that began at the train platform, with a brutal separation where Nazi doctors and SS men would point either to the left, toward immediate gassing, or to the right, toward the slave labor details, a separation that meant life or death, that divided families never to be reunited, and from which there was no return to ordinary existence. And survivors of Auschwitz reported that this process, the selection, the separation, the reduction to a number, represented the first phase of a systematic dehumanization that would continue until murder or liberation came. Those selected for immediate killing were herded into chambers, stripped of their clothes and their dignity and their very humanity, and subjected to Zyklon B gas, a pesticide crystals that produced hydrogen cyanide, which would asphyxiate them within minutes. Their bodies then burned in vast crematoria, with such efficiency that entire families could be processed from train car to ashes in a matter of hours. The ashes then scattered, or used as fertilizer, or dumped into the rivers and forests surrounding the camp, all evidence of their existence methodically erased, a decision that revealed the obsessive nature of Nazi genocide. The way that the Nazis did not simply want to kill their victims but to erase them from history itself, to remove all evidence that they had ever existed. The decision to pursue extermination, rather than mere expulsion or forced emigration or enslavement, represented a crossing of a line from which there could be no return, a commitment to an ideology of racial purity so absolute, so uncompromising, that it demanded the complete obliteration of an entire people, an entire continent's worth of people. And Hitler, in making this decision, and in insisting on its continuation long after the military situation had become hopeless, placed himself and his regime beyond the pale of ordinary human morality, transforming Nazi Germany into a state whose primary function, beneath all the military and economic apparatus, beneath all the propaganda about racial destiny and national renewal, was the systematic murder of millions of defenseless human beings who had committed no crime except to exist, to be born into a category that the Nazi state had decided should be exterminated. One of the darkest dimensions of Hitler's decision to pursue genocide lay in the complete cooperation and complicity of vast swaths of German society, from industrialists like Gustav Krupp, who profited enormously from the confiscation of Jewish property and the use of slave labor in their factories, to scientists who conducted hideous medical experiments on camp prisoners, including children, in the name of racial science and military advancement, to doctors like Josef Mengele, who selected victims for the gas chambers and conducted lethal experiments on twins and dwarfs in a grotesque parody of medical research, to the countless ordinary citizens who knew what was happening and chose silence, a silence that itself became a form of consent, a tacit acceptance of the unthinkable that allowed the machinery to continue grinding forward, and the complicity extended to railway workers who drove the trains, to administrators who processed the paperwork, to guards who watched over the camps, creating a vast conspiracy of silence and cooperation that implicated thousands. Hitler's decision to accelerate the persecution and eventual extermination of homosexuals, another category of human beings deemed racially and socially unfit and morally degenerate, resulted in approximately 15,000 homosexual men being imprisoned in concentration camps, where they faced systematic abuse, forced medical experimentation, castration, and murder, often marked by a pink triangle that identified them to other prisoners and guards alike, a visible badge of shame that made them targets for additional harassment and abuse, a decision that reflected Hitler's obsession with creating a racially pure and sexually orthodox society composed of heterosexual, able-bodied citizens who would populate the new Germanic Empire and produce the next generation of racial warriors according to Nazi racial doctrines. The decision to pursue eugenics programs that included the forced sterilization and eventually the murder of thousands of disabled Germans, termed by the regime "lives unworthy of living," represented another dark chapter in the systematic elimination of those deemed biologically or socially unsuitable for the new racial order. A program that began in 1933 with the Law for the Prevention of Genetically Diseased Offspring and eventually evolved into the T4 euthanasia program, which murdered approximately 250,000 disabled individuals before being officially halted in 1941 due to public outcry from the Catholic Church, though it continued in various forms throughout the war, in concentration camps, and in the extermination camps of Poland. A program that established many of the procedures and psychological mechanisms that would later be employed on a vastly larger scale against other groups deemed racially unfit. The decision to wage a war of racial annihilation against the Soviet Union, launched in June 1941 in what Hitler termed Operation Barbarossa, was not simply a military campaign aimed at defeating a geopolitical rival, but a deliberate plan for the conquest and subjugation of Eastern Europe, a decision rooted in Hitler's ideology of Lebensraum and his belief that the vast territories of Russia and Ukraine, populated by what the Nazis termed inferior Slavic peoples, rightfully belonged to the German people and would serve as the breadbasket and the territorial foundation for the Thousand-Year Reich, a war that would ultimately claim approximately 27 million Soviet lives, including some 14 million civilians, making it the deadliest theater of the Second World War, and a testament to the murderous consequences of Hitler's territorial ambitions and his complete disregard for the lives of non-German peoples. The decision to implement systematic starvation as a weapon of war against the Soviet Union, a policy articulated in Nazi planning documents that explicitly calculated how many millions of Soviet civilians could be allowed to starve in order to feed German armies and the German civilian population, a document that showed the cold calculation at the heart of Nazi policymaking, resulted in the deaths of approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners of war, held in camps, and untold millions of civilians in occupied territories. A decision that revealed the callous calculation at the heart of Nazi ideology. The reduction of human life to mere economic variables to be managed and optimized like any other commodity, with human beings reduced to nothing more than calories, to be diverted from the mouths of the conquered to the mouths of the conquerors. Hitler's decision to commit Germany to a two-front war, to attack the Soviet Union while still engaged in conflict with Britain, a decision that violated basic principles of military strategy that all of Germany's military planners understood, a decision that even many of his generals cautioned against, and that Winston Churchill and other observers recognized as a strategic blunder, stemmed from his ideological conviction that the destruction of the Soviet Union and the conquest of Lebensraum represented the ultimate purpose of the Nazi state. More important even than the careful prosecution of the war against the Western powers, a decision that would ultimately prove catastrophic. As Germany found itself unable to simultaneously fight the Western Allies and the Soviet Union with sufficient force to achieve victory against either, a strategic overreach that set the stage for ultimate defeat and the partition of Europe between Soviet and Western spheres of influence. The decision to construct and maintain the vast network of concentration and extermination camps, a decision that required enormous resources in terms of transportation, construction materials, labor, and administrative personnel, resources that could have been directed toward military production, and that military planners repeatedly argued should have been redirected, reflected Hitler's commitment to his racial ideology even as the military situation deteriorated throughout 1943 and 1944. Even as Soviet armies advanced westward toward German territory, and American and British forces pressed eastward, even as Germany's economy began to strain under the burden of total war, Hitler continued to insist on the maintenance and even the expansion of the killing machinery, prioritizing ideological purity over military necessity, choosing to murder his victims, even when doing so was demonstrably harmful to his own war effort and his prospects for ultimate victory. The decision to begin the systematic murder of Roma and Sinti peoples, often termed gypsies by the Germans, who were deemed racially unfit, socially dangerous, and genetically inferior, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands, though the exact numbers remain uncertain due to the Nazis' deliberate destruction of records and their view of Roma as less than human, unworthy even of the bureaucratic precision applied to Jewish victims. A decision that demonstrated that the Holocaust was not solely about anti-Semitism, but represented a broader commitment to racial purification through murder. A vision that encompassed anyone who did not fit the Nazi racial ideal or who threatened Nazi social order. And the fate of the Roma reveals that the Holocaust was in fact a vast genocidal project aimed at multiple victim groups. The decision to pursue aggressive Lebensraum expansion and to subject conquered populations to Nazi racial classification and selection, with many Slavic peoples deemed useful only as slave labor for a period of years and destined for eventual elimination once they were no longer economically valuable, resulted in the systematic enslavement of millions and the deliberate policies of privation and murder aimed at reducing their numbers and keeping them in a state of permanent subjugation. A decision that revealed the cosmic scope of Hitler's racial ambitions and the casual brutality with which he contemplated the restructuring of an entire continent according to Nazi racial ideology, with populations to be moved or murdered or enslaved as strategic necessity and racial doctrine dictated, and the Nazi leadership never fully implemented these most ambitious plans, only because they were ultimately defeated militarily. Hitler's decision to wage total war, to mobilize every resource of German society toward military production and conquest, a decision implemented through the Nazi four-year plan announced in 1936, and later expanded and intensified under the direction of Albert Speer, who became armaments minister in 1942, fundamentally transformed German society and created the conditions under which genocide could be industrialized and systematized, as the state's monopoly on violence and resources was extended into every aspect of German life, from education to labor, to reproduction itself, from the control of newspapers and radio to the conscription of children into Hitler Youth organizations and the indoctrination of the entire population with Nazi ideology. The decision to eliminate political opposition within Germany, to consolidate absolute power in Hitler's hands and to destroy any vestige of democratic process or constitutional restraint, resulted in the imprisonment, torture, and murder of thousands of political prisoners, dissidents, clergy members, trade unionists, and intellectuals who dared to question or resist Nazi policies, a decision that created a totalitarian state in which dissent was literally dangerous, and fear permeated every aspect of society, from the factories to the universities to the family dinner table, ensuring that the machinery of genocide would face no internal opposition capable of stopping it, no space for the expression of alternative values or moral objections, and the Gestapo and the SS became the mechanisms through which this total control was maintained. Hitler's decision to maintain the fiction of legality and bureaucratic procedure, even as the state engaged in wholesale slaughter on an unprecedented scale, resulted in the creation of an administrative apparatus that gave the appearance of order and legality to mass murder, with paperwork filed and procedures followed, and forms completed in triplicate, transforming Holocaust perpetrators into mere functionaries, executing orders rather than conscious participants in genocide, a decision that revealed the modernist nature of the Holocaust, the way that industrialized society and rational bureaucratic systems could be harnessed in service of evil, the way that modern administration could obscure moral responsibility and distribute it across so many individuals that no single person felt entirely responsible for the total outcome. The decision to prioritize ideological purity over pragmatic governance, to insist on the elimination of Jews, even in territories where they might have been economically valuable as labor or as sources of taxation, revealed the fundamentally irrational core of Nazi anti-Semitism, the way that hatred transcended economic or strategic calculation and became an end in itself, a decision that many historians argue represented a form of collective psychosis in which the Nazi state became willing to harm itself economically and militarily in order to satisfy its genocidal impulses and to realize its utopian vision of racial purity, a vision that no amount of military reversal or economic calculation could persuade the Nazi leadership to abandon. Hitler's decision to expand the definition of racial enemies to include not just Jews but also Slavs, Roma, homosexuals, disabled persons, political prisoners, Soviet prisoners of war, and various other groups deemed undesirable, revealed the totalizing nature of his vision of racial purification. A vision so grandiose and so all-encompassing that it would have required the murder of hundreds of millions of people to achieve, even partially, a decision that demonstrated the way that ideology can override rationality and turn a state into an engine of pure destruction, a mechanism whose purpose becomes the killing itself rather than the achievement of any rational political or economic goal. And if the Nazi regime had not been defeated militarily, it would have continued murdering vast populations indefinitely. The decision to encourage and reward the participation of ordinary citizens in the persecution and murder of minorities, through both official and unofficial channels, through the Hitler Youth and the SS and the local administrators and informants, and block wardens, created a society in which complicity became normalized and ordinary, in which the neighborhood grocer might report on Jewish neighbors, and the schoolteacher might enthusiastically embrace racial ideology, and the factory supervisor might collaborate with the SS in the selection of slave laborers, a decision that implicated vast segments of German society in the crimes of the Nazi state and demonstrated how systems of terror and incentive could mobilize entire populations toward participation in genocide. Hitler's decision to deny basic humanitarian assistance to prisoners in the concentration camps, to starve them, and work them to death, and subject them to hideous medical experiments, decisions made at the highest levels of the Nazi state, and relayed through administrative channels to camp commanders and guards at the lowest levels, resulted in suffering so extreme and so deliberate that it transcends the ability of language to adequately describe it. A calculated campaign of cruelty and degradation aimed at breaking the spirits of victims before destroying their bodies. A program of systematic abuse that included torture and mutilation and psychological terror designed to reduce human beings to animals. And the survivors of these camps bore physical and psychological scars that lasted throughout their remaining lives. The decision to manufacture racial propaganda on an unprecedented scale, to establish entire institutions dedicated to the promotion of Nazi racial ideology, to control every newspaper and radio broadcast and film and piece of literature to reinforce Nazi racial doctrines, created a society in which alternative perspectives were impossible to access, and in which children were indoctrinated from birth with the belief in German racial superiority and the necessity of eliminating racial enemies, a decision that transformed ideology into the very air that people breathed, making it nearly impossible to escape or resist, a decision that demonstrates the totalizing power of modern propaganda technology when placed in the hands of an authoritarian state. Hitler's decision to extend persecution to the families of those deemed racially or politically undesirable, to imprison children alongside their parents, and to execute family members of those who resisted Nazi authority, created a system of terror that reached into the very foundations of family life and made opposition dangerous not just to the individual, but to everyone they loved, a decision that weaponized human affection and familial bonds as instruments of control and coercion, a decision that reveals the way that totalitarian ideology penetrates into the most intimate dimensions of human life. The decision to maintain detailed records of the Holocaust, to create elaborate bureaucratic documentation of the murder of millions, to preserve lists and files and photographs, even as the ovens burned and the graves filled with bodies, reflected the Nazi obsession with orderly administration and the grotesque belief that genocide could be managed through the same rational procedures that governed ordinary government. Functions: a decision that preserved evidence that would eventually testify against the perpetrators and ensure that their crimes would never be forgotten or diminished. A decision that reveals the mentality of the perpetrators, their belief that what they were doing was systematic and rational and justified. And the very documentation that Nazi bureaucrats created to record their atrocities would serve as the basis for the prosecution of war crimes after the war's end. Hitler's decision to extend the Holocaust beyond the borders of Germany itself, to pursue the murder of European Jewry across every occupied territory, from France to Greece to the Soviet Union, necessitated the establishment of an elaborate transportation network to move millions of people to their deaths, a decision that required the cooperation of Nazi collaborators and sympathizers throughout occupied Europe, revealing the way that genocide could mobilize vast segments of society across national boundaries and turn occupied peoples into active participants in the destruction of others, creating a system of complicity that extended across an entire continent. The decision to implement racial hygiene programs that included the forced sterilization of approximately 400,000 people deemed genetically unfit, programs that preceded and established the administrative and ideological groundwork for later extermination camps, demonstrated the way that Nazi ideology could be implemented through ostensibly scientific and progressive language, with eugenics presented as rational biology rather than genocidal ideology, a decision that corrupted the entire German medical profession and turned doctors into agents of state terror rather than healers, a decision that reveals the way that pseudoscience and racial ideology became intertwined in Nazi thinking. Hitler's decision to view the Second World War as fundamentally a racial war, as a struggle between the Aryan race and its enemies for control of the world, created a framework in which military operations and genocide became inseparable, in which the conquest of territory and the murder of its inhabitants were understood as aspects of the same process, a decision that transformed ordinary combat into something more sinister, into a war aimed not just at defeating enemy armies, but at the complete elimination and racial restructuring of entire populations, turning the war into a cosmic struggle of racial survival and supremacy as Hitler conceived it. The decision to pursue genocide, even as the military situation deteriorated catastrophically, even as it became clear by 1943 that Germany would not achieve victory, even as resources became scarcer and the need for military production more acute, even as German cities burned under the Allied bombing campaign, demonstrated the way that ideological commitment transcended rational self-interest, the way that Nazi leaders chose to continue murdering millions even when doing so was demonstrably harmful to their own war effort and hastened their own defeat, a decision that revealed the depth of their commitment to racial ideology and the way that this ideology had become the raison d'etre of the Nazi state, its ultimate purpose and justification. Hitler's decision to deny prisoners in concentration camps access to news of the outside world, to create a complete monopoly on information, and create an isolated universe in which Nazi power appeared absolute and inescapable. Decisions made through the control of all communication and the systematic destruction of any possibility of hope or knowledge of potential liberation contributed to the psychological devastation of victims and their sense that resistance was impossible and that the Nazi horror would continue forever. The decision to implement the Holocaust gradually, to allow the machinery of genocide to expand incrementally, rather than announcing a comprehensive plan for mass murder at the outset, meant that international opposition never crystallized around a specific moment or event, but rather developed slowly and unevenly as reports of atrocities accumulated, rumors spread, and photographic evidence gradually became known, a decision that strategically weakened the international response and allowed each new escalation of violence to be absorbed and normalized within the pattern of Nazi persecution. Hitler's decision to attempt the complete annihilation of the Jewish people, to pursue this goal with resources and personnel and industrial capacity that could have been directed toward military production and toward the possibility of German victory, a decision made not in a single dramatic moment, but emerging from years of escalating persecution and extermination, a decision that would ultimately consume vast portions of the Nazi state's energy and resources, represented perhaps the most profound moral choice ever made by a human being in the opposite direction of morality, a choice to pursue destruction rather than creation, extinction rather than preservation. The decision to order the evacuation of the camps as Soviet armies approached in early 1945, a decision that led to the death marches, in which thousands of weakened prisoners were forced to walk hundreds of kilometers in the dead of winter, dying of exposure and starvation and disease, represented one final act of cruelty from a regime that could not accept the liberation of those it had sought to murder. A decision that demonstrated the way that the Nazi commitment to genocide persisted until the very last moment of the regime's existence. The decision to maintain the concentration camp system until the very last days of the war, to continue murdering prisoners as the war drew toward its inevitable conclusion, to resist the evacuation and liberation of camps, even when it became clear that the war was lost, demonstrated that the Nazi leadership would have continued the killing indefinitely had they not been forcibly stopped by military defeat, that there existed no internal moral break, no moment of conscience, no willingness to halt the killing even when every rational consideration argued for an end to the slaughter. The darkness of Hitler's legacy lies not simply in the specific decisions he made, but in what those decisions revealed about human nature and about the potential for ordinary societies and ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. When ideology provides the framework, and when leadership provides the direction, and when circumstances provide the opportunity. And the study of Hitler's darkest decisions serves as a permanent warning about the fragility of civilization and the constant vigilance required to preserve human dignity and human rights against the encroachment of totalitarian ideology. The memory of the Holocaust, the physical embodiment of Hitler's darkest decisions, must serve as a warning that echoes across the decades and must be heeded by every generation, a reminder that the machinery of genocide is always closer than we think, that it emerges not from some separate category of evil people, but from ordinary human beings making small choices, incremental decisions, compromises with conscience that gradually lead toward unthinkable darkness, and that the only adequate response to the memory of the Holocaust is an eternal vigilance against the ideology of racial purity and racial supremacy, a commitment to the defense of human dignity and human rights, and a recognition that the Holocaust was not inevitable, not the product of historical forces beyond human control, but rather the result of specific choices made by specific people who could have chosen differently, and who stand as testimony to the fact that human beings possess the power to create unspeakable evil, and must therefore also possess the responsibility to resist it, to oppose it, to speak against it, and to ensure that such horrors never again darken the face of the earth. A commitment that requires each generation to understand the specific mechanisms through which genocide emerges, to recognize the warning signs of authoritarian movements that seek to divide humanity into categories of superior and inferior, to defend the rights of minorities and the vulnerable, to resist the seductions of ideology that promise simple solutions to complex problems, and to maintain institutions and systems of accountability that prevent the concentration of absolute power. And it is through the study of Hitler's darkest decisions that we gain insight into the nature of human evil and the requirements of human goodness. The way that evil emerges not as something alien and incomprehensible, but as the result of choices that seem reasonable and justified to those who make them. Choices that are normalized through repetition and institutional support. Choices that gradually reshape the moral landscape until previously unthinkable acts become not merely thinkable, but mandatory. And the counter to this process lies in constant moral reflection, in the maintenance of ethical clarity about fundamental human rights, in the refusal to compromise with ideologies that seek to divide humanity into racial or ethnic or religious categories, and in the recognition that democracy and human rights are precious gifts that must be actively defended and renewed by each generation, for they can never be taken for granted. And the voices of the victims, the millions who perished in the Holocaust, and the millions more who suffered under Nazi tyranny, cry out across the decades demanding that we remember, that we bear witness, and that we commit ourselves to the eternal struggle against hatred, against intolerance, against genocide, and against all forms of totalitarian darkness. A struggle that begins with the decision to remember and ends only when we have built a world in which such horrors can never again occur.